We are so happy to see you all. And Janice and I were just talking about our normal way to talk to the world, which was Twitter. It's like, what is the way to talk to the world? So,
Mhm.
hey, world, we're talking to you. We are just delighted that you could join us for this first of three sessions this year, building on the work that we've done over the last 4 years, folks. Is this our fourth year?
Mhm.
But we're reverse aging. We're all much younger than we were. Our series is called Centering Indigenous Pedagogies in Math Education, and we're really focusing and we're digging into assessment as a focus. I am not actually on Seal territory today, everyone. I'm on Stolo territory, which I'm so grateful for. So Joanne, we could probably wave to each other. And I'm so grateful, not just to be here, but to be part of a trail restoration project in Sayward with a Sayward. And Sayward's a partnership between three local nations, and just to be learning from knowledge holders and elders on their land about restoration in their land. And so we were just learning today about the advocacy of the local nations to take back land that is theirs, which settlers had encroached upon, and how this restoration project has engaged the high school here that I'm working with around this idea of respectfully engaging in. And once you receive the stories or the messages from the nation, how that compels us to take action because we have responsibility. And so I'm just so grateful to be here. And normally I'd be joining you from Seal territory where I work. And we have these incredible partners, which I know Cynthia will help me explain as we go. But we're just so excited to partner with the Indigenous Math Network, the David Robitaille International STEM Education Network, Dogwood 25. And we're very grateful for financial support from the BC Ministry of Education and as well as the Rural Education Advisory. What's nice is you can find links to the recordings from these sessions on pretty much all of these websites. So this really is about sharing and learning together and really helping us to be able to come back and learn from these ideas. And so please come back and watch again. And if you signed up for the series, you will receive an email in about a week with a link to the recording, and you're welcome to share that with others or rewatch or just re-engage with the ideas and let them wash over as you're trying to work through these ideas yourself. And now I pass
Okay.
to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Cynthia Nicol, who's always wondering when is Leighton going to stop talking.
Thank you, Leighton, for starting us off well, and welcome everybody to our session. My name is Cynthia Nicol, and I'm a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at UBC and a member of the Indigenous Math Education Network that's helping to facilitate our session today. And this is all hosted from UBC, which is on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam people. So we'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves and the lands that you're currently on. You can, or wherever you may be, you can feel free to write that in the chat as we're just kind of introducing ourselves and getting started here. Our session is centering Indigenous pedagogies with a focus on assessment. And I'd like to just introduce my colleagues and those who will be co-hosting with me on this session. We have Joanne Archibald, Kwang William from UBC and Dogwood 25, Janice Novakowski from UBC and School District 38, Richmond in the Lower Mainland, Stephanie LaFrance, who is a doctoral student at UBC and currently in Edmonton. And of course, you've met Leighton, who needs no more introduction. um, and I also want to introduce to you Kuganjad, which in the Haida language means mouse woman. And Kuganjad is a supernatural shapeshifter. You'll be familiar with her if you joined some of our previous sessions. Here is a Haida artist, Billy Yovanovitch's design of Kuganjad. And Billy says that Kuganjad is always around and sneaks up on you, kind of like math does, to try to lend a helping hand and help solve a problem. So always there and always helping. Our guiding question for this series continues from the series that we did last year on centering Indigenous pedagogies and perspectives in math education. You can find all 4 of these sessions at the Edith Lando website. And you can see the address there at the bottom lower right of your screen. So we're going to build on some of the work we did last year. And also it extends the work that we did 2 years ago in 2022 and 2023, where we hosted some sessions on culturally responsive math assessment. So this current series extends our thinking where we're going to draw on some of the teachings from Earth and Indigenous Storywork practices for thinking about assessment. So it brings us to our current series, 3 series on today, the February 26th and April 16th. And our question is, how can Indigenous pedagogies and perspectives guide us as teachers in our mathematics education assessment practices? And we've taken on the topic of assessment alongside Indigenous pedagogies just because we know it's a real challenge for us as educators. And our work and conversations with teachers, we just understand how complex assessment is in all its forms, like thinking about how we use assessment to inform our teaching practices, to provide feedback to our students and families, and to make decisions about grading, whether or not a student should be promoted to another grade or scholarships, and it goes on. And our evaluations of how and what math students know and can do can at the same time be really harmful and really traumatic in some ways. So it can impact students and how they feel about themselves and their relationship with mathematics and their confidence with math. So it's an important area that we want to pay more attention to. And mathematician Frances Su writes about how all of us, like teachers of mathematics and even those not working in a school, all of us teach both negative and positive values and experiences. So when a parent accepts that their child is struggling or says they don't like math, and the parent says, okay, that's fine. I was never very good at it either. Then they're teaching values about who can and can't do math and who math is and isn't for. So these quotes from Francis Hu, I think, are quite important. So he says, thinking about how every single one of us, whether we realize it or not, is a teacher of mathematics. And all of us, no matter who you are or where you're from, can cultivate mathematical affection. So doing just the opposite of these negative feelings, having this kind of feeling of it and cultivating it and a relationship with mathematics that is flourishing. And at the same time, all of us can, and I would say I'd add to that, need to read ourselves differently in terms of our relationship with mathematics. So how we assess, how we make sense of our own experiences and those of our students really matters. And that's what we're going to do in this session. We have 3 perspectives that we're working through and playing with about thinking about assessment and Indigenous pedagogies in math education. First, we've got, we're going to explore assessment as ecosystems, and then think about assessment as Indigenous Storywork, focusing mainly on the 3 principles of holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. And then we'll also focus a bit on thinking about assessment as pedagogy, and we'll share some examples from the elementary and high school, secondary classrooms. So we see these 3 perspectives as really interconnected and overlapping. So you'll see elements of each of these in each other. So it's more about kind of pulling the perspective to the foreground and trying to pay attention to it than it is trying to separate these out more specifically. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about assessment as an ecosystem. And I'm going to draw upon the story of Ku. And you'll see on the slide that Ku is written in 2 different ways. It represents the dialect, the 2 different dialects of Haida on Haida Gwaii. And Ku is a sea otter. And here's a design by Corey Savard of the sea otter. So the sea otter, Ku, and Haida Gwaii, that's the characters that are in this particular story. So the Ku and Haida people have had a long history of living together. And here you can see a map of Haida Gwaii and where its placement is in relationship to the rest of BC. And the Ku were really an integral part of the ecosystem. They provided food and resources to Haida culture and society. And the Haida and the Ku even ate some of the same foods like sea urchins and clams and crabs. And the Haida used the Ku furs for their regalia and their ceremonies. So the Ku and the Haida lived together in a way that really made sure that each were sustainable, that they could get enough food from each other and they could keep kind of a healthy, balanced ecosystem. But then this close relationship between the Haida and the Ku was really changed in the early 1800s with the maritime fur trade. And with the fur trade, the coup populations just went down drastically, and the coup basically became ecologically extinct in the local waters off of Haida Gwaii. So without the coup, the waters and the under forest, like in that little diagram there, of Haida Gwaii was really changed. It became more like this because the coup were one of the few to really eat these large red sea urchins. And without the coup eating the sea urchins, then the populations of the sea urchins grew dramatically. They increased, and the sea urchins ate all the kelp right down to almost nothing. You can see there's no kelp in this photo. And without the kelp, then there weren't any rich ecosystems that protected and nourished all the other species like the herring and clams and salmon. There was just this kind of red sea of sea urchins, just a monoculture. But the really fascinating thing is that around about 10 years ago, around 2015, there were some of the first sightings in over 150 years of the coup mums and their pups. And by 2019, the Parks Canada and the Council of the Haida Nation counted around 13 coups. So they really have now thought that they've been reestablished in the waters around Haida Gwaii. And so this is really encouraging news, and it's really been bringing people together across Haida Gwaii to try to think about, well, how is this going to change what's happening in the waters around Haida Gwaii? It's going to take some time for the kelp to grow back like it was at this one time, and what else will change as a result of that, and who will be affected, both human and non-human. So the story really inspired me in thinking about interconnections between this kind of renewed kelp forest, this this tentative balance between those within the ecosystem, and then just the resilience of nature and the return of the coup, and a reminder that everything is connected to everything else. So this idea of assessment as pedagogy is what we're going to play a little bit more with in terms of it being embedded in everything that we do. So just want to say briefly, to go from the waters to the land, you can think about this ecosystem as similar in terms of looking at moss. And there's many examples, of course, of ecosystems on land and water. But Robin Wall Kimmerer, in her books, she's from the Bear clan of the Potawatomi, and she describes how water moves on mosses, not by looking at pipes and pumps, and not even with roots, but instead with the shape of the plant itself and how the plant holds the water and moves the water. And you can, so hard to maybe see in this particular slide, but it's the water isn't really stored by any one part of the moss, but in collaboration with everybody there. It's a colony of working together to share the wealth. And Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about it in human terms, saying that it's not about the rich getting richer and the poor getting more poor, but instead how everyone benefits. It's an ecosystem where we're all giving and we're all being able to benefit from it at the same time. So Kimmerer says very slowly, mosses even take a break or just a pause when they're growing. If the conditions aren't very right for them to be very flourishing, then they'll just stop and grow again when the water and the nutrients are in abundance. And that, I think, if we think about our own practice as educators and our own classrooms, about what it takes to have to create the conditions for growth and student learning, and what that might look like. So I think what this teaches us is that how we can learn about assessment practices from examples in nature and earth around us, like the coup and with the mosses. And we can think about then assessment as ecosystems in terms of thinking about relationships, the value of collaboration, not just focusing on only individual success, and think about that in terms of assessment. Thinking about assessment in terms of its contribution to a community that's thriving and its well-being. And then also creating these conditions, these life-friendly conditions that will benefit all of our students, human and more than human. But thinking about mathematics, thinking about our own classroom, how do we create these life-friendly conditions with assessment in our classes? And then finally, thinking about it in terms of being integral to all aspects of our teaching. So that's a little introduction to thinking about assessment as ecosystems. And we're going to revisit this in our sessions, the next two sessions, what we're focusing on. But for now, let's move to thinking about the perspective of assessment as Indigenous storywork with Joanne Archibald from Williams. So Joanne.
Great. Yes, you call us. Hi, Cynthia, for starting us off, and Leighton. I join you today on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in the Vancouver area, and I'm grateful for the stewardship and the loving care that Indigenous peoples have carried out with our environment and the more than humans. I wanted to start with this image here of a cedar basket made by a Stalo person quite a few decades ago now, and I thought of this basket when I first started learning in a deeper way about Indigenous, traditional, and life experience stories. I was very fortunate that Stalo, and that's where I am from, people of the river, the Stalo elders mentored me and taught me over a number of years. And I was learning from the elders after I became a teacher, and actually before that, but really when I was a school teacher, I started working along with Stalo elders and Kokolitsa Cultural Center at the time, and trying to find, I don't know, ways that I could address Stalo learning, and assessment, of course, became part of that. But it really was a question of the time of, trying to learn about Stalo ways of knowing, being, and doing. Learning, we used the term culture at the time. And I was, I think, very lucky to be introduced to various Stalo stories that the dear Stalo elders revitalized, reclaimed after decades of colonization, where they were forbidden and it was outlawed to practice cultural ceremony, to engage in then the Halkamilam language. So the elders were very careful about how they were trying to revitalize Stalo ways, and especially stories. And I, recall one time going to Kokolitsa Cultural Center, and I wanted to learn about making a basket. And this was a basket made with cedar roots and some of the bark, but mainly the cedar roots. And I had learned that Stalo people carefully went out to gather the roots. I wasn't able to participate in that, but the teaching was that, the Stalo cultural knowledge holders knew, how much to gather from the cedar tree of the roots, so it would stay as a living being. And they also knew how much to take from the bark. And then we were able to take those roots and prepare them as materials for weaving cedar baskets. And I remember going to this class where there were a group of, then it was Stala women, and one of the elders, Teresa Michel, a master basket maker, was teaching people to weave these baskets. And me, I had also been educated in the Western system, of course, through public school, through university to become a teacher. And so when I went to the class, I expected the teacher, like most teachers of the time would start to give directions on how to make the cedar basket. So when I went in, I sat down and I saw, the Stala women starting to work on the basket. I saw the elder teacher, Teresa, working on a basket, and sometimes she would go and sit with one of the women and look like she was showing her how to do something. And I waited and I thought, oh, I wonder when she's going to start. And after a while somebody came and sat with me and showed me what to do, and I eventually caught on that this was Teresa's way of teaching, that we would learn to help each other, and she might work one-on-one and show somebody how to do something, and they would continue on. And that was the time I realized that there was quite a difference in some of the traditional ways of teaching and learning that were Stalo and those that were from a Western-based school system. So eventually I spent more time with various Stalo elders, and I learned to be patient. I learned to observe. I learned to listen. And especially with stories then, that I learned a way of making meaning with and from the stories. And eventually I thought of it as like this basket. You can take the different pieces, the strands that might help us understand stories. And as we learn to really understand and know these strands, know these pieces, that we could then make a beautiful basket that I call the story basket. And I thought of this maybe first of all as a metaphor. Later it became more than a metaphor, but this metaphor of a basket where we can take the teachings from the land, from nature, the materials from the environment that would help us live. Baskets are very useful tools for us, but at the same time, they're very beautiful. And you could make a beautiful design, and you'd have to know how to create that design from those materials. And then to think of, we have to be careful with taking, the material from nature so it sustains nature and will sustain us. And we learn to work with these materials. So I thought of that with stories too, that our stories have been with us from time immemorial, some of them, and some are new stories, like our life experience stories. And we have to learn how to learn from them. We have to learn how to respect the stories, how to treat them in a responsible way. We can learn to help others know what we know, and also having a deep awe and wonder with the stories. And so this is what I call this approach, Indigenous story work, that stories, often in our cultural gatherings, we hear the spokesperson who is facilitating the cultural work at the beginning will say, "My dear ones, the work is about to begin." And when we hear that phrase, then we start to pay attention to what is going to happen. So I also thought that our stories needed this careful attention after decades, of colonial assault upon our Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, that we had to then treat our stories in a way that fits in with the cultural context. We have to maybe put aside some of the Western frameworks for a while so that we could open ourselves up to learning about Indigenous, and in this case it was Stala ways of um, uh, learning and being in the world. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So with that, you see, this is kind of a bit of an attempt to show a bit of a weaving. So what I learned is that with the 4 R's noted here, these might help us get ready to engage with stories. And I have talked about, you know, these 4 R's in very brief ways. And if you want to learn more about the 4 R's, you can take a look at the website there, where I go into more depth into each of these principles there. But today's session, we're actually focusing more on the other 3 principles of holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. I've often thought of these lately in trying to introduce these principles to others, that these 3, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy, can guide us in our pedagogy. And of course, assessment is very interrelated, linked, with pedagogy. And that, so we're going to start with those rather than the 4 R's this time. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in thinking about holism then, it could be a way that we think of these realms, our intellectual, the emotional, the physical, which can include not only our bodies, but our actions, and of course the spiritual, like heart, mind, body, and spirit. And our stories may speak to us in various ways, and will have some of these realms in it that connect to us or connect to the context, the situation of either student, family, community, nation, or our wider society. And they could relate to our past, present, and also our future. So that's just such a brief kind of high level overview of what holism can include. And I thought about then this questions about math assessment and the practice of math assessment. So I thought of these questions that might be helpful as we bring together this idea of, could be Indigenous traditional or life experience stories with, how they can help us as teachers, as educators, with our practice of our math assessment. So how can my math assessment practice then reflect any of the holistic understandings? So in here, how could this assessment practice reflect any of, the Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing? How might it reflect the emotional parts? Or how might, some of the spiritual understanding? And I relate maybe spiritual also to reverence in one of the 4 R's. And perhaps I could link it to when I was thinking about a basket, and thinking about, wow, that basket came from this beautiful cedar tree. The cedar tree, to Stalo and of course to many Indigenous nations, is an integral part of our ecosystem. The cedar tree has provided so much for the humans, the Stalo humans and others, for helping us survive, our shelter, for cooking utensils, and for clothing, for many things, and for medicines, and I felt that awe and wonder that that beautiful cedar tree, had provided us humans with so much. And then at the same time, I also thought about the cultural knowledge holders who knew how to harvest from the cedar tree so that the cedar tree stayed as a living being, but at the same time could provide us with some materials that would help make a better life for us. so with that, I thought about that context of the past and thought about today. We still, as Stala people, there are still basket makers. And then thinking about, we can even, I stretched this somewhat as a metaphor for thinking of a basket weaving for learning from and about Indigenous stories. So the other principle then of interrelatedness, of course, um, focuses a lot about relationships, connections amongst people, the more than humans, our environment, the connections to heart, mind, body, and spirit, and to past, present, and future. So when we think of these connections, then we might ask ourselves in our math assessment, how might we include some considerations about these relationships or these connections that might be related to students and the family and the local environment? And I think we will, in a few minutes, have some examples of assessment as pedagogy that connects the students and the environment. And we could question how assessment comes into this. And, again, how might the assessment be guided by any of these holistic realms? So we're not just focusing on the math test, the math textbook, but we're broadening, our math assessment to ensure that students will feel excited about math and about showing what they learn, which connects to the earlier point Cynthia was making. Next slide, please. So in relation to synergy then, so one of the dear elders with whom I learned was Kawasselwit, Dr. Ellen White from the Nanaimo First Nation. And she helped me understand this notion of energy, and she'd often say that, when we start to think about energy, and especially with stories, if we talk about the stories or if we do something about stories, like even role play, perhaps connect art with a story or any kind of learning, what we're really doing is creating some new energy with the story. And with this energy, this action, maybe we come up with a new idea, a new question, or we strengthen what we know, or we might have a bit more courage to take on, something that we're kind of anxious about. And so with this synergy, it's often happens when we do something, and when it could be me, Joanne, Kwam Huam, doing something, like I tried to learn to make a cedar basket long ago there, and I had to learn a different way of doing the work. And sometimes we have to learn a different way, maybe, of doing assessment. And perhaps we then, with this, learn different ways. We can, this multimodal learning, it's holistic too. It's, we could engage in creative ways, all kinds of questioning, experiential learning, through mentorship. And it still could include, of course, learning with the text or with some of the tests, but it's not just focusing on those assessment tools. It's much broader, and placing those in relationship with these other very important cultural and also maybe community contexts. So with the synergy too, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, our big ideas about assessment being part as an ecosystem, as Indigenous storywork, and as pedagogy, there is a relationship. There is new energy being created as we think of the relationships among these big ideas. So that's what we're going to go to next. So
Thank you, Joanne. So we thought this would be a good time to ask you, audience, to think about with a question or to reflect back or pull out a question that's a pressing assessment issue for you related to your practice, and just plop it in a shared Google Doc. And the link for that will be in the chat. So if you are able to do that now, you don't need to author it. You can just stick your question in there, and then we'll have some things that will help us think about, what are each of us thinking about in terms of assessment? What are those pressing issues or pressing questions, perhaps related to what's been shared so far or not? It doesn't matter, but stick something in there if you have something that you can share, and that we'll revisit this throughout the rest of the webinar. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, so our next perspective is assessment as pedagogy. And with this, we have two examples, focus points, I guess, contexts, one at the elementary level and one at the secondary high school level. So we'll start with the elementary early childhood context with Janice Novakowski. Janice.
Thank you, Cynthia. Let me forward to the next slide. So in thinking about assessment and pedagogy, I drew on some of the work in early childhood. In British Columbia, we define that as 0 to 8 years old. So, birth to grade 3 or so. And some of the terms that come up that are very much connected to what Joanne was speaking to in terms of Indigenous story work are the ideas of being responsive, that reciprocal learning is happening, and that there's opportunities for reflection, both on the teacher's part and then on the student's part as well. And then I think the living experience in an early childhood classroom is really very much that ball toss or dance. There's an ecosystem that's happening there between both assessment and instruction, and between students and teachers. And so authority is decentered, and we try to decenter power as well, and provide opportunities for our youngest learners to have agency over their own learning. So it really is that responsive pedagogy that very much intertwines and embeds assessment as part of our instruction. The perspective of teaching as noticing is very, well described in the math education literature. So that idea as positioning yourself as a noticer in the classroom. So what do you notice? And then what are you choosing to respond to, and being mindful of that? And cognizant of that. And then what interpretations are you making based on what you're observing and noticing? And I think in the early childhood classroom, in our primary grades, children often aren't able to communicate in written form or symbolic form. So we do draw upon what we're able to hear, what we're able to observe, what we're able to notice them building or creating or talking with their classmates. So, positioning yourself as a pedagogy of listening and a teacher as noticer, I think is really fundamental to this position of assessment as pedagogy, that we're, that's just an embedded part of our practice. I think in mathematics education or in any area of learning, we want to create opportunities for children's wonders and their questions, and emergent learning or projects that might come up through their play or their investigations in science or art or physical education, whatever it is. And so as the classroom teacher or educator, you need to be aware of the learning standards at your grade level so that you can bring those to the foreground and think about what is going to be your next instructional move, or how might I assess this learning in the moment, that assessment for learning piece, and then also that evaluation piece, like where are we drawing upon different experiences as valid pieces of evidence of learning. And Joanne spoke to that a little bit in terms of, looking at ourselves as educators and, rethinking and reimagining what assessment could be. And it can be a conversation. It can be sitting alongside a child as they're playing with blocks and noticing and observing what they're able to do and what math doing and knowing they're capable of. Thinking about different ways to collect evidence of learning in collaboration with children. So again, that it's a mutual reciprocal relationship that we have with the children in our care, in our classrooms. And so, I've been in classrooms where children come up to me and offer, Miss Novakowski, look what I can do, or look what I've done, or look what I've learned. And how do we capture that evidence of their learning and their willingness to share and show their learning with us? And then, in terms of the assessment cycle and our language that we have in British Columbia around assessment, where are we creating openings for children's reflections and self-assessment? And how is that opening up ways for children to use language in different ways, to use materials in different ways, to write, to express? And it doesn't all have to be the same way. It doesn't have to be written down on paper to count. How are we opening up those opportunities so that children can express and share in their own time frame, in their own places and spaces, and in their own ways? So I'm going to share a little bit of a project that we did in our district. And this was in collaboration with a grades 1 and 2 teacher, Catherine Myers at Spilakwax Elementary, and her grades 1 and 2 students. And so this was actually a 2-year project. And so I'm going to share the second year of this project where we were looking at connecting place and mathematics through story. And so we had done a project the first year. I'll share a little bit about that, but this year's project was really focused on mapping and that connection to the land and the waters. So I'm just going to pause here and just share with you where I'm joining you from. I am joining you from the lands and waters of the Hunkaminam speaking people. And I live and work in Richmond, the Richmond School District, what's now called Richmond, and live in the Steveston area where the river meets the Salish Sea. And that's very much connected to this particular project. So these students are on the northern side, northern western corner of Richmond, where another arm of the river meets the Salish Sea. And, we spent considerable time getting to know the lands and the waters around them and the species, the living species that live in those lands and waters around the school grounds and where the children live. So when thinking about this project and designing it with the classroom teachers, some of the big concepts that we thought about and mathematizing this project, we thought about the importance of locating and mapping, designing, measuring, quantifying, and then the importance of spatial reasoning. And we know how significant that is from the math education research, particularly for younger children, to set them up for success in so many ways. When we looked at curriculum connections in British Columbia, we have such a huge body of curricular competencies that are learning standards that we draw upon. And these are just some of them, that we came up together with, for grades 1 and 2 students connected that we would likely be nurturing and developing during this project. Again, we want to leave lots of space for emergent learning and children's contributions to the project. And then again, we anticipated that the curricular content that would come up would be number concepts to 20 and 100. It's grade 1 and grade 2, direct linear measurement, and then addition and subtraction to 20 and 100. And probably we figured some geometry or spatial sense as well coming into that. Next. So the first year of the project, we did look at local place-based stories, those that were public and available to us. And one of them was the double-headed serpent, which is one of the origin stories from Musqueam. And there is a publicly available video that Musqueam collaborated with. And so we watched the story a couple of times to make sense of it with the students. And then the students created their own sort of renditions of that with materials. And you can see an example of that on the left with a child's example of the two-headed serpent made out of clay and how it's moving through the land, creating the creek and the river. And so, again, this one story, inspired students to think about doubling. And if that serpent was moving through and, each part of the serpent was taking down trees as it moved through the lands, how many trees was that taking down? So a very, simple mathematizing of the story, that idea of doubling. On the right, you see where we also built local knowledge and understanding and using the language of place, the Hunkaminam language. We looked at the Musqueam language and culture resource called Musqueam, giving information about our teachings, which is available in our district, but also through the Musqueam and Moa Museum of Anthropology websites. And there's Indigenous speakers from Musqueam saying how to pronounce all these words for these different animals and trees and plants. So it's just building knowledge and building understanding. And this has happened the previous year, which led to this next phase of the project. So maybe next, Cynthia. And just some examples again of what these students had had experiences with. They did a lot of story workshop in their class where they were building stories and telling stories with materials, building language, and then creating and writing stories as well. Next. So this was the launch of the next phase of the project the following year. And again, connecting to lands and waters. We looked at the lands and waters from multiple perspectives and using multiple maps. So we used current political maps with street names and that sort of organization. We looked at the delta animation of how these lands and waters developed over hundreds of years. And then we looked at the traditional place names map from the Musqueam website. And again, built students' understanding. Many children in this class, although they knew that they were close to a river, they didn't really realize that we were on an island in Richmond and that we were completely surrounded by water and that where we were sort of positioned in the world. So we were trying to broaden their understanding of their place in the world and that connection to the local land and water around them. Next. And so after looking at several maps over a couple of days, we asked students to design their own maps and put significant places to them on the map. So this was, grade 1 and 2 students don't have a really strong understanding of proportion or scale. So it was interesting to watch them navigate that and the spatial reasoning that they brought to that task. And then, it's interesting to see what they put on, whether it was maybe a temple that they went to or Costco or Richmond Center or McDonald's or their school, the things that were significant to them that they placed on their maps. And then we looked at all their different designs and looked for sort of that similarity in the shapes of the different islands and the land bases or land forms that they included. And then from that, we came to consensus about some general shapes, and we can share the next slide. And so from that, students worked in small groups and created felt-based maps of some of the islands. Richmond is comprised of actually many islands, but they chose Sea Island and Lulu Island and Swishwash Island, Shady Island and Steveston Island, and created these islands. And then they added acrylic paints to add texture. They did the rivers. You can see those on the top right. They knew the color of the river because they've walked along the river a lot. And then they did the ocean as well, or the Salish Sea. And so we had all these different pieces. And then students were able to configure them however they liked to create their math stories with them. Next. And so this is just one configuration where you can sort of see the islands and then the rivers are surrounding them and then the ocean on the side. And then alongside this, we were developing some other materials and we had a collection of wooden animals and trees and plants that students could move around and add to these maps. Next. And so the classroom teacher also had several materials. We used some of those as well. And children were invited to create story maps, looking at land, looking at place, and thinking about mathematics. And so what stories might be inspired by place. We live, surrounded by rivers, but we also have a lot of farmland in Richmond. So some of those farm stories came up as well. And students were aware of that. And other stories that made meaning for them. And then the question was, where's the math in your story? Or how might math help you solve a problem that comes up in your story? Next. And so this is just one example, again, where students created a farm setting together, and they built a family. And then, their big math problem, which would really be considered like a numeracy task here in British Columbia, is how much food do they need to grow to feed the family for a year? And what are all the different things you would need to consider for that? How much of different things do you eat each month or each week? And then do you multiply that or add that? And just thinking about different ways that they might estimate or solve a big meta question like that. Next. Another example was a small group of students. There had been a war in the village, and they needed to rebuild a large house for all the families in the village. And so what materials did they need? How big does it need to be? What are the other considerations we need to take into consideration? Next. And then this is another one. These students used the story map that we had created, most recently, and the bunnies were eating carrots, and they needed to get over to Sea Island, and so they hopped on the salmon's backs, as they do when you're 6 years old, and were carried over to Sea Island. And again, it's how many carrots do we need, and what is the right way to harvest and take plant materials. And so one of the grade 2 students reflected, this lesson is about learning from our elders. And so the bunnies only ate just what they needed. That's the math, knowing how much is enough. And so that idea of like, how much is enough for today or for this week? How many things do we need to pick? Next. And so again, as the students were engaged with creating these stories over a couple of days, a couple of sessions, these were some of the nudges or the provocations that the classroom teacher and I provided to help students focus on the mathematics. So what math might you find in your story? How does math help us to understand this place and the lands and the waters around us? How might math help us solve a problem or explore an issue in your story? How do the characters in the story use math in their daily lives, at home and in the community, in cultural practices? How might this become part of your story? And so the idea was that students were like iterating their stories and learning from each other and sharing their stories and building on others' ideas and integrating new ideas to their story. How does place inform or inspire your story? How might you include local species, culture, place names, or local languages in your story? Next. So again, as we go back to thinking about assessment as pedagogy, how does this project reveal how, as the educators, were being responsive, reciprocal, and reflective? Where do you see that ball toss or that dance between assessment instruction between students and teachers? What did you notice? What are you wondering? What would you respond to? What interpretations might you make? And again, what learning standards are coming up for you? Whether you teach grade 1 and 2 or grade 5 or 6 or grade 10 or 11, what connections might you be making to a story project like this? And then how are you collecting evidence of student learning? When they've got stories built on the carpet and they're moving around with materials, how are you collecting that evidence of what they're learning, and what are you centering and what are you not centering? Next. And so these are some of the questions that came up for us. As teachers, what mathematics emerged during the process of responding to the stories, mathematizing the maps that we were viewing, creating maps, creating and telling math stories. And maybe if you want to pop some thoughts into the chat, what were you thinking what do you think was coming up as students were having those different experiences? The creation of the maps was a whole mathematical endeavor in itself. And then their math stories were another additional project. What was the learning goal? We had a learning goal for the project, and that was, again, connecting place and story and mathematics. That was our big meta learning goal. But individual students had learning goals as well, and we're working towards that, whether it was thinking about numbers or practicing addition or thinking about measuring. What curricular competency might you focus on for assessment? And I'll share the one that we were looking at. And then would this be a numeracy task for those of you that are thinking about that? And then how are we creating different ways for students to show and share their mathematical doing and knowing? And yes, next is the curricular competency that we focused on. This is a K-12 curricular competency in British Columbia, and it's about engaging in problem-solving experiences that are connected to place, story, cultural practices, and perspectives relevant to local First Peoples communities, the local community, and other cultures. So really what we're measuring or what we're assessing is that engagement. And engagement is pretty subjective in terms of how we measure that in terms of assessment. And so we can think about cognitive engagement, we can think about physical engagement, we can think about social emotional engagement. So there's different types of engagement that we can think about, and then to what degree are students engaging? And next. And then so Stephanie and Cynthia are going to be talking a little bit more about this framework, but this idea of these big ideas that might help support you as you're thinking about assessment as pedagogy. So that idea of attunement and tuning in or readying ourselves to notice mathematical doing and knowing, the potential for mathematical doing. So what might we anticipate? Mapping those possibilities. And then I spoke about this a bit earlier, discerning, noticing, and responding. What is our role? And then what content might we be engaging with, and how are we setting that up for those opportunities? And so on the next slide is just some examples from this particular project. Again, the teacher and I thought about, in terms of attuning to our planning, what vocabulary and language might the students need to contribute to these discussions? What awareness do students have about the local lands? What math might come up? And what sort of nudges might we need to support students with around that? And what, our knowledge of the curriculum, what we bring to that. And then when they're creating their stories, how might we respond so that we're, highlighting the mathematics and drawing that focus to the foreground with the students? We knew that we would build in gallery walks and partner shares, so students again could have that synergy together, so they could gather ideas and feedback for each other throughout the process, not just at the end. And I think that that's a pretty significant, thing to remember. And then again, content engagement. How are we helping these young children, 6 and 7-year-olds, think about what mathematics is and where it is in the world around us? So what do you notice? What do you wonder? What is the math? What math do you see? What math is in your setting, in your characters' daily lives, their interests, or their identities? Where are they in the story, and how might math be used to solve a problem in the story? So hoping that some of those phrases might support you in your thinking about designing projects and tasks that sort of weave in assessment and pedagogy together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janice. You've given us lots to think about there, and now it could be an opportunity for anyone to stick another question in the shared Google Doc, maybe a reflection or a thought or a connection that you've made to what Janice has shared related to thinking about assessment as pedagogy, and perhaps even making some connections to Indigenous assessment as Indigenous Storywork, and thinking about holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. Maybe there's something there that sparked some connections for you that you might be able to put in the document as well. So while you're doing that, we're going to just move to thinking about assessment as pedagogy at the secondary school level. And we've got a couple examples here. I'm just going to briefly kind of introduce them, and hopefully we'll have a chance to go into more depth on these in our next session. But one is around called Blanketing the City in Vancouver. And it's a mural project that was initiated by a Musqueam weaver, Deborah Sparrow, who is a very famous weaver. And this project was inspired around 2018. And it's a public art series that takes Coast Salish weaving patterns and moves them into really large scale murals and even light installations like on the Rogers Arena and the stadium. So BC Place Stadium, is it called that still? I don't know. Anyways, the stadium itself. So I'm just sharing these as examples of projects that students could take on, where they might take like a public art tour and a math walk and try to notice and engage both the art and the mathematics. And they could maybe design their own art or math walk and decide what to feature, what prompts to give the visitors, what path they might want to take through the exhibit, what things in their community they'd like people to notice, and then what mathematical engagement they would like people to take up in that particular walk. So it would be a math and community public art series. So there's just a couple resources here that Janice pointed out to me. This is a really interesting, I haven't read this book, but it looks like a really interesting book around, well, maybe something beautiful, how art transformed a neighborhood. And there's also the Reggio inspired math blog, where the teachers took a math walk, an urban math walk, with some materials, and then they were stopping along the way and noticing various particular points and thinking about and talking about the mathematics that they noticed. But students could do a similar thing. They could create their own art, math, urban walk or rural walk, and use that as a way to think about assessment as pedagogy, where we might be looking to see what it is that students are paying attention to, what they're noticing, what they're thinking about mathematically. And here's another just example that we can maybe hit on, touch on a little bit in another session, is thinking about this project, which is a project with my colleague Susan Drosky and I, looking at mathematical labyrinths. And the whole community of Hornby Island, which is not very big, came together and tried to think about how to build a mathematical labyrinth as the community, which is a really, it's a short amount of space for a long distance walk, in a sense, because you're moving around it in a really different way. So we're exploring the mathematics as a form of art in the community and thinking about how that might bring people together, both through math and through art. And then another piece we're just going to touch on here is looking at daylighting creeks and restoring riverbanks. I'm just going to talk a little bit about daylighting creeks, and Stephanie will go into more detail on restoring riverbanks. In Vancouver, and here's another just example of in Vancouver, like Vancouver was once a beautiful rainforest with a whole bunch of networked streams and creeks that you can see here that are in blue. But with development and as the city grew, the streams were taken underground and put into pipes and diverted and put together with sewage and rainwater to go out to the English Bay or to the Strait of Georgia. But then, and these are these kind of big culverts that were built in the 1950s or so. But when you do that, then you're building culverts that make it really impossible for the salmon and wildlife to thrive, because they can no longer go upstream to be able to spawn. So these are just a couple of slides that have taken where you can see that there's only probably a handful of streams that are visible in the whole Vancouver area. Everything else has been diverted through these culverts. But about 8 years ago, the Vancouver Parks Board, in collaboration with some other organizations, worked on daylighting the Tatlow Creek here. So I've just circled it here. So this goes right into the English Bay. So, and this is a conceptual drawing of what they were going to do, of trying to create some wetlands, dig up those culverts and allow the creek to flow. And it took about 8 years or so to be able to do that. And now it was just finished last year. You can see here the image of it. It hasn't, it needs more rainwater to actually, so that you can see the creek here. But the water, the bed of the creek is all set for it to flow right into the ocean. So this is an example of a project that students could work on to think about how they could participate in designing where to place the plants. How do you actually decide which rivers or streams or creeks you would like to daylight to bring to the surface? What is the mathematics and those kinds of decisions? And what are the implications of that? So, and how would you measure the impact of the daylighting? So just some ideas for us to think about as we move into thinking about one of these examples in more detail, which Stephanie will offer. and looking at the Saskatchewan River and the restoration of the banks of the Saskatchewan River in Edmonton, where she is. So I'll invite you, Stephanie, to take on the next piece.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, I am joining you from Edmonton, which is the meeting place and relational spaces of the Dene, Métis, Blackfoot, Nakota, Sioux, and Saulteaux peoples. And it's designated as Treaty 6 territory. So I thought I might bring in an example that's relevant to the specific space that I live in. Currently, we have a restoration project at our park, Horlock Park. And what they're doing is completely revamping it, replacing the water drainage. They're ensuring that the paths along the river are not degrading too much. They are replacing the pond. They're replacing some of the plantation that's in there. The plants are being replaced with indigenous species. And so it really is a project to be in a better relationship with the land and community in and around the park. And knowing that assessment in secondary is, there are so many different parts to the ecosystem that is assessment of secondary education, because we have these larger scale tests, and we have specific modules in the program of studies. The curriculum can be a lot more dense, and so there are a lot more things going on. So what I wanted to do is highlight my process for beginning with a context and developing assessment through an exploration of that context. And so part of that involves thinking about the bigger mathematizing that's happening. So the ways of being mathematical, we can think of locating or mapping, designing, measuring, explaining. And then I thought, okay, now let's think about the skills and competencies that are involved in exploring this kind of a context, because there are multiple professionals involved in this restoration project, which means there are multiple disciplines, multiple mathematical concepts and skills involved in such a big project. So some of the ones that came up for me are exploring and analyzing, applying mathematical ideas, using technology, modeling contexts, thinking creatively, and wondering about the problem. So students might think like, oh, I wonder what plants are they going to put in there, and they could look into that information. Or they could be wondering, how are they going to help with the drainage and redo the drainage systems. And then also developing and demonstrating, applying mathematical understanding through play, story, inquiry, and problem solving. So what is the story of this particular park? How is it related to other areas in and around the park and the lands and the river that it lines with? And then my thinking is, if I think about mathematizing and then I think about competencies, I'm essentially trying to narrow down to the content standards by working with the bigger ideas first and sort of teasing out more specific mathematical information that could live within this context. And so the proficiencies from the BC government here, for me, really aligned with this particular context in terms of making connections to a real world problem, extracting and organizing information. So in order to understand this project, one would have to organize a bunch of information, a bunch of data about the project, and then identifying what parts of that information are important mathematically and applying that. And then next slide. So then moving to more specific now, general mathematical concepts could be ratios and distribution of plant life. So certain plants live well together and other plants should be planted further apart. And then architectural concepts like the curvature, slope, and scale and angles of the drainage, of the pathways. There's again mapping, of the space, and there could be scale factor involved in mapping that space. And then the content standards, systems of linear equations for the drainage pipes, perhaps, or connecting data, graphs, and situations. What different elements are playing into this restoration project. And then again, there is often a need to review previous grade content, and so there is grade 9 content of spatial reasoning and proportion, statistics, financial literacy in terms of like budgeting the project. And so that was sort of my process, is starting with the big mathematical ideas and trying to tease out further and further in detail in preparation for being able to create specific assessment prompts that I could use with students with this context. So the next slide. These are some prompts that came to mind, and they certainly aren't the only ones, but what do you notice and wonder are really, it's a really open, great way to start a conversation. And what information or professionals would need to be consulted for such a project. Essentially, these questions would be guiding students to kind of understand the multiple dimensions of the project that are even more than mathematical, so interdisciplinary, and have to do with the land, the story of the land, perhaps students' experiences in that park, and really situating assessment within a relational space, a place where students feel that they can come to that assessment environment with their whole selves and exploring the bigger picture first, and then kind of teasing out mathematics as they go. So in terms of numeracy, things like seeking information that they need to solve problems or to figure out more about the project, modeling, and mathematical problem solving. And so the assessment prompts, you can kind of think of it, they flow throughout as the activity is moving. So what would that look like? Concrete, you know, if we're in a classroom, what would that look like? What would the students be doing? What would we be thinking about pedagogically? So we could think about students working in groups, think tanking together about the project. We could think about how they might plan an investigation where they explore mathematics that they see. That would be a more open investigation, or perhaps it could be scaffolded to a specific mathematical concept that the teacher decides on, or the students and teacher decide on as a group. Then they could potentially apply the learning that they come to through this activity to a new concept. They could create a word problem or a story. They could go to a park that they're familiar with and think about how that park could be restored, applying those same mathematical knowings and doings that they develop through the activity. And pedagogically, you know, assessment doesn't live alone. It lives with other aspects of teaching, which include relationships and communal practice. It involves openings for students to share their stories, their knowledge, and their contexts, and thinking about them communicating with you and you communicating with them about the learning. So that could involve listening, speaking, writing, drawing, making, like I said, visiting other parks and spaces. It would be a whole mix of modalities, like Joanne had mentioned, and also in terms of looking at it like an ecosystem of multiple places of relating with the students. So in terms of assessment as pedagogy and the bigger ideas, in terms of attunement, how do we prime ourselves to notice students being mathematical, to listen and inquire about student thinking in a holistic way? And then what can we do to prepare ourselves for identifying specific content and competencies, proficiencies, and mathematical doing that emerge within that context through conversation or observation. And then thinking about the potential of different contexts for mathematical doing. Certainly we can say math lives everywhere, but there are particular contexts that may provide sort of an easier entry and anticipating the potential of those contexts, the mathematical potential. And then discerning, noticing, and responding in the moment. How do we as teachers decide in the moment whether an utterance or a particular observation is a critical moment for assessment, for understanding where students are at and understanding where we want to go next in the learning, and setting up a mathematical inquiry where there are multiple opportunities to observe students in a more relational, holistic way. So for content, we might think about questions, prompts like, what do you notice? What do you wonder? What math lives here? What mathematical problems can you see, and what information might you need to solve those problems? And these are sort of you can see the connections to Storywork of the holism. And these are the questions that Joanne had posed. How might assessment practice reflect holistic understandings of Indigenous ways of knowing and doing? How might assessment practice consider cultural and community contexts, the interrelatedness? How might assessment practice include considerations about and connections among students, their families, their local community and environment? How might assessment practice be guided by holistic realms? And it really is about planning for more than content. It's planning for the experience of that assessment moment or event. It's thinking about the whole environment, the relationality of it, and these variables that we may not, we may forget to consider in terms of planning for assessment. And then finally, synergy. How might assessment practice reflect students' synergistic processes and understandings? And how might assessment practice facilitate multimodal learning and sharing opportunities?
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Again, a lot to think about in that, and I understand I'm not in the Google Doc because I'm operating this or the slides, but I understand that there are some good questions in there, so I'll continue putting questions in, and if anything that was shared here with Stephanie that you're able to share, that would be great. Or thinking about the connections among the assessment as ecosystems, assessment as pedagogy, and as assessment as storywork. And so just to wrap up our session, I would like to invite Joanne to just say a few words of what she's noticed in terms of those kinds of connections among the three areas that will lead us into thinking about what we'll be able to do in our next session in February.
Great.
And sorry, Joanne, while you're doing that, we do have a poll that we would like everybody to respond to. And maybe we can launch the poll while Joanne is sharing a little bit of what she notices between these three perspectives. Thank you, Joanne.
Okay, great. Well, if you recall at the beginning when I spoke, I mentioned that what I was learning from various Stalo and other Indigenous elders and cultural knowledge holders, it was a lot I was learning about in the way of our traditional and life experience stories. And then I was thinking about how to make sense of all this wonderful knowledge and ideas, and what do I call this all these things that I was learning. And I then drew upon my experiences of growing up as a Stalo person and being in Stalo cultural gatherings where a spokesperson facilitating our learning, would say, "My dear ones, the work is about to begin." And at that point, we give serious attention. And people who are part of that gathering, are there to share what they have learned, or to bring up important things that we might think about, or to ensure that we are practicing, cultural protocols, cultural ways of various sorts. And I think that our session today is like that. We, have given serious attention to this big topic of centering Indigenous pedagogies in mathematics education. And we're taking time to really emphasize assessment within this big approach. And we have drawn upon our various experiences, those of us who have shared what we have learned. And we wanted to introduce kind of three big approaches or big ideas, that this assessment is like an ecosystem, and it's also like, or we can learn from the ecosystem. We can learn from Indigenous story work, and we can learn from pedagogy. That ecosystem, Indigenous story work, and pedagogy, of course, are very much interrelated to assessment, and interrelated or connected, as they are distinct entities, but they also, work together in ways. And so we have shared that in this session, and we have shared a lot of information and many questions. And we intend to continue going into these areas of the assessment as ecosystem, as Indigenous story work, and as pedagogy in our other two sessions. And we invite you to take a look at, the recording of this webinar to help, go back to some of the specific ideas, that have been presented. And for yourselves, find the links among these three things. For me, I have appreciated the introduction to the sea otter at Haida Gwaii, and the bit of the history of, that sea otter becoming extinct, but for some wonderful, reason and ways, the sea otter, they are coming back to Haida Gwaii and being a part of the ecosystem. And that really helped me think about the resilience, of the more than humans. And then to think of our own resilience as humans, and how we might then work with the students and have them become excited about learning mathematics, and thinking of the connection to place and mathematics. How can place and more than humans help us learn mathematics, and as educators help us assess mathematical learning of the students? That we have to think about the ecosystem, the whole context, and when there are challenges, to know that if we give attention to the challenges, we can find different answers and approaches. And some of the answers and approaches, for example, could be through Indigenous story work, where I was able to learn from elders and storytellers and cultural knowledge holders about the power and beauty of stories to become like a teacher, to help us learn, to help us be good human beings to ourselves, to others, to nature, and to find ways that we get ourselves ready to engage with these stories, to engage with mathematics assessment, that might also both encourage and challenge us to think about the assessment in maybe different ways or broader ways. and that we can ensure that assessment is brought together with pedagogy, with thinking about the ecosystem. And there are principles such as the holism, interrelatedness, and synergy that can help us. And that today we've drawn on experiences of educators helping us to think about early childhood or grade 1 and 2, and thinking, over a 2-year period, how the grade 1 and 2 students have learned about stories of place, to think about the mapping of place, to think about how they learn various mathematical understandings connected to place and story. And then also going to the high school level to know that we can take the math walks in a city and sort of learn from what we see of the visual art and bring that together with mathematical learning, which will be done in subsequent sessions. But also to go to another place like Edmonton, where Stephanie, has shared what we might learn through a park, and think about grade 9 and 10 mathematics. And so I hope that through this session you've been able to link to one of these ideas, whether it's a pedagogy that Janice has shared with us over a 2-year period with young students, or what Cynthia and Stephanie have talked about with thinking about high school level and still drawing upon place and story and mathematics, that we know we can bring this all together. And there have been very exciting ideas for assessment that we can then identify and perhaps put into practice. So this has been a rich cultural, a gathering that thinks maybe about the Indigenous pedagogies and math assessment. In many of the Indigenous cultural gatherings, we are the hosts. We want to ensure you are fed well. So we think we have fed you great ideas that you can feast on and think about further, and that we, are wanting to acknowledge the Edith Lando site and pass this information on to some of your friends. We encourage more people to come to the next gathering on this topic, and on February 26th. So we look forward to looking at what you have put in the Google Docs, and some of those questions will help us also provide some things to think about for February 26th and April 16th. And if you have other comments you want to put in the chat, please do so. But now it's time that we draw to a close this webinar session. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.